President Barack Obama has signed a $1 billion aid package into law for Ukraine. The Treasury Department says the funds will help stabilize the new government. It punishes Russia for letting Crimea join its federation, slapping sanctions on specific people. It's all part of a larger international aid package coordinated by the U.S. and its European allies. Experts say the new Ukrainian government needs $20 billion, and that's just this year. Now, earlier I spoke to U.S. Senator John Hoeven to discuss America's response to the crisis in the Ukraine. Senator Hoeven is one of several lawmakers pushing Obama to take further steps, including increasing natural gas exports to Europe. I discussed with the senator if the current sanctions are enough.
There's more that we need to do, particularly in regard to helping both Ukraine and Eastern Europe with energy. Right now they're dependent on energy from Russia, and that's a problem in terms of getting the EU to stand with us to really impose the kind of sanctions we should put in place to deter Russia from further aggression.
You are proposing an amendment to the extension of unemployment bill that's currently being discussed now in the Senate. That Senator Reid may not let that go on the floor, but we'll get to that in a bit. Let's talk about the amendment itself. You're going to basically ask the White House to say yes to the Keystone XL pipeline construction and also expand the LNG exports. Explain what you mean from that and what the benefits might be.
Well, that's exactly right. We call it the Energy Security Act. We've offered it as an amendment on the unemployment insurance bill, and it really makes sense to do that because it creates jobs. More than 100,000 jobs will be created, and I think that's a very conservative estimate. And remember, what we're trying to do is help people who are unemployed, and the way to do that is to get them a job. It's not just about getting them some help when they're unemployed, it's about getting them back to work. That's what our legislation does, but it also helps us produce more energy in this country so we have energy security and provide LNG to our allies in Europe, again, to help them stand up to what's going on with Russia.
How likely is this bill going to get support, I should say this amendment, whether it's on this bill or any other bill that you ultimately attach this to?
Right now, Senator Reid is not allowing us to have a vote on the amendment as part of the UI bill, which is the legislation on the floor. But I'm confident we are going to get a vote on it at some point, and we have very strong bipartisan support. So we're going to get it. I think really the issue is, when.
The polls have shown that the Americans, while they are watching the Ukrainian crisis, they're also wary of perhaps any domestic activity that they take on behalf of the politicians that would ultimately affect what's happening in Ukraine. How are you going to convince the American public that this ultimately is good for just domestic job growth and also competing with the forces with respect to Russia and their control of the gas to Ukraine?
It's a big-time job creator. It helps us with economic growth. It creates revenues to help with the debt and deficit through economic growth rather than raising taxes. And it really is about a long-term strategy to deter the kind of activities that Putin has taken in Europe. Because by providing more energy, working with the EU, we strengthen them to stand up so that we have a unified front to tell President Putin no more.
Who are the opponents to what you're trying to accomplish and why?
Some of the extreme environmental interests that just don't want to see fossil fuels used. The American public overwhelmingly supports this legislation. In the polling, it's something like 70%. And that's why ultimately I'm confident we're going to get it done.
Regarding this amendment, you mentioned earlier that Reid is not likely to let this go on to the floor. I guess that puts you in a precarious situation as to how will you move this forward without the support of Senator Reid?
Well, I think the UI bill may advance without it, as we've discussed, but there are going to be other bills coming to the floor. We'll continue to offer it, and again, we've got a lot of bipartisan support. So I think it's going to be very hard for Senator Reid not to allow us to have a vote on it at some point. And again, I think we'll have the support to pass it.
I'm curious, have you heard from the White House on their perspective on this?
We have talked to the White House about this at length. I think what you see happening, though, is both on the part of the American public and in terms of international events, what's going on in Europe. I think that's putting a lot of pressure on the administration to ultimately support, or at least come around and if not agree to our legislation, not hold up the vote in Congress.
regarding a timeline, how soon, if this were to pass, whether it's through this particular law or some future law, how quickly would that produce not only the jobs, but also the activities that you expect with respect to Ukraine?
Well, first off, in terms of jobs and activity, that starts right away. For example, Exxon is looking at building a facility in Sabine, Texas. That's a $10 billion investment. That's just one of 24 projects that have applications pending. So you're going to see economic activity right away. Also, it's going to send a signal to the energy market that there's going to be sources of LNG besides Russia. Third, we're also working with countries like Norway and Statoil to bring LNG into Eastern Europe now in the short term. So again, this is about having both a short-term and a long-term strategy to deter Russian aggression. Rather than just going to the military option, it's saying, hey, there are things we can do with economic and political sanctions and other steps to make sure that Russia stops the kind of activity that we've seen in Crimea.
Last question for our viewers around the world. The U.S. has taken perhaps a more leadership type role with respect to this crisis. But at the same time, some would argue that the Europeans perhaps could do a little bit more. Have you had much reaction from them? And on top of that, explain to our global audience what America's role is in this crisis.
So right now, Europe gets about 30% of its gas from Russia, and it flows through Ukraine. So one of the reasons that the European Union is reluctant to stand up and impose the kind of sanctions that need to be put in place against Russia to truly stop what they're doing is because the EU is very worried about their source of energy. That's why an energy plan has to be part of building a united front between the U.S. and the EU to really stop Putin's adventurism into Eastern Europe and specifically Ukraine.
And what do you think America's role should be?
Leadership role, stepping up with a strategy like I'm talking about. And again, not lurching from crisis to crisis, not just short-term steps, but an overall strategic approach with our allies to address this situation.
That was Senator John Hoeven of North Dakota speaking to me earlier today.